Hey everyone, Pugs here with just one new review for y'all, because as you can see by the sudden aspect ratio change, today I am covering Truth or Square, the 10th anniversary special of SpongeBob SquarePants. Wow, it's super weird, but also cool to think that I've now covered 10 years of the show's history, and there's still so much left to cover. How exhilarating, but also a bit terrifying. Anywho, there's definitely a lot I could say in this introductory portion of this review, whether it be about the show's 10th anniversary or even better, the reputation of this special, but I think that I'll leave that all for the proper review, because it'll fit better there. So, for this part, let me just skip on over to saying thank you to everyone who's decided to tune in today. Your viewership is, as always, very appreciated. And now, let's just get right into reviewing this supersized episode. Truth or Square? My oh my oh my. This episode? This episode right here? Yeah, this was a modern SpongeBob hater's wet dream back in the day. Man, they were using this episode to talk about every issue they had with the show because this was SpongeBob's 10th anniversary special. The hatred towards this episode was surpassed by few others, at least back in the heyday of the hate. Nowadays, opinions are far more mellow, I believe. But anyway, hopefully y'all are picking up on the air of derision I have here, because it's there on purpose. I've always felt that the hate for this episode was overblown, even back when I was influenced by these popular opinions. Especially now, looking back, it just feels utterly ridiculous. Before rewatching this special for the purposes of reviewing it, I hadn't seen this episode in years. This made revisiting this episode even more exciting because I love revisiting old hated things. Like I said before, I think opinions on this episode have mellowed out. So while I still believe that this episode is notorious, the hate towards it is nowhere near what it was. Hopefully this means I can get through this review without someone pointing a pitchfork my way. Right? So, to start things off, I want to begin by talking about the theme song, since that's our opening to the episode. And man, I've always loved the version of the theme song used in this episode, like the CeeLo version. It's just so groovy and neat, and the visuals are fantastic. Like, this stop motion is so good, and I like to think of it as a precursor to the stop motion specials we'll be seeing later. The puppet at the beginning, I love it, even if it does look like it just crawled out of the depths of hell. And while I keep discussing this intro, I guess I should also take the time to say what might be the obvious. This is the first episode to use the widescreen, or 16 by 9, format. It's so weird making visuals for my reviews like this. Too rectangular. At least we'll be back to normal until I get to season 9. And before I get back to the show, I gotta go on a brief tangent and talk about how happy I am that this special came out during the time that promotional tie-in games were common, because this episode originated one of my favorite games ever, SpongeBob's Truth or Square, specifically the DS version, as that's the only one I ever played, and it's pretty different from the other versions. At least it doesn't reuse music, heyo! Okay, but seriously, I love this game. It's so nostalgic, and I play through the whole thing at least like once a year. It's just so fun. I love the memory aspect of it. It feels like a proper celebration of the show. That phrasing implies that this episode isn't a proper celebration of the show, and that's not what I meant to say by that. Let me move on. Okay, one last thing before I actually really start going through the episode, but I feel like I need to spend a second addressing one of the aspects of this episode that people hate on for some reason, and these are the celebrity appearances. Now, I don't give a fuck about celebrities, let me make that clear right now, but why did people hate this again? Like, this episode is a big ol' celebration. Celebrity cameos make sense to me, especially the way that this episode did it. It's the show buying into its own hype, and I like that, because it deserves to do that. I mean, come on, SpongeBob SquarePants is one of the most popular shows of all time. I think it deserves to show that it knows that every now and then. Alright, that's all the side notes for now. Let me get into this episode for reals. So, like usual, when it comes to these specials, I'm going to talk about the Patchy and SpongeBob segments separately rather than going straight chronological. And like usual, I'm starting with Patchy. These segments are, of course, where we get all of our celebrity cameos and how Truth or Square leans into its own hype. I enjoyed the narration segment at the beginning, discussing 10 years of Patchy in a very meandering way. I thought it was funny. Now that I think about it, it's one of the many examples of Season 6's utilization of awkward humor, and I thought it generally worked here. So, Patchy heads to Nickelodeon Studios so that he can host his 10th anniversary special and meet SpongeBob. One thing this episode does really well is show how freaking obsessive Patchy is, and I love it a lot. I loved the scene with the guard, who, fun fact, was played by Roger Bumpus. It doesn't take long for us to start getting our celebrity cameos, and I personally find that they were done nicely with the setup of Patchy calling all of these people. I thought it was a clever way to get these celebrities without having to bring them on site or anything. And, okay, I just gotta say it, but I remember when certain reviewers back in the day were so mad about the fact that the Rolodex shot was a retake, and I mean legit mad. Like, I remember this quite well. And my thing about that is, the Patchy segments are supposed to be low budget, so no matter if the retake being this obvious was intentional or not, it helps to sell that image and fits perfectly. So it's really not an issue, at least not to me. Okay, back to talking about the celebrity cameos for another moment. So even if some of these celebrities are clearly phoning it in, which is funny given the method of getting these cameos, I truly could not care less. Like, I'm not here to see these guys give a performance, I'm here to just see these random people in a SpongeBob SquarePants episode, you know? I also think that the inclusion of some of these random celebrities adds some humor for the adults watching as well, especially with the older celebrities. Moving on a little bit, I think the humor in these Patchy segments is great. Like, the joke about Tom Kenny was absolutely brilliant. So many layers to that one. And then the part where Patchy starts laughing like he's lost his entire mind, it just gets me dying every time. I love it. And then the entire part with Robin Williams is most definitely the best of the celebrity cameos in my mind. Like, it was actually so funny. His delivery on "this is where careers come to die" is legitimately imprinted into my brain. It's great to see Nickelodeon be able to poke fun at itself, you know? I mean, I don't know how much creative freedom the crew has. I assume it's rather considerate, or considerable. But still, the willingness to take a crack at Nickelodeon is very much appreciated. And then after the bulk of the celebrity cameos is a bunch of random shit, which is typical for a Patchy segment. Like, he goes to try to find SpongeBob, and then he gets eaten by a whale, and then he meets SpongeBob. I love how clearly, unhinged Patchy is in that scene. The ending of his segment is great and just so bizarre too, and then I love the return of the narration from Ricky Gervais. It has the same awkward quality as earlier, and it works. And the very ending of it, where he talks about the 20th anniversary, well, it's funny seeing that now on the other side of not only the 20th anniversary, but the 25th anniversary. God, I love this show. Alright, let's talk SpongeBob. So, the SpongeBob part of the plot parallels Patchy's part and the real-world event of the 10th anniversary of the show nicely, with the 117th anniversary of the Krusty Krab being celebrated. But before I get into that, let me just say that since this special is so fucking long, I'm going to refrain from going through things strictly chronologically like I normally do when I review episodes. Instead, I'm just gonna kind of be grouping together different elements of the episode, kind of like what I did when I reviewed the SpongeBob SquarePants movie, but also a little different. You'll see. So, the first thing I'm going to talk about are the songs in this episode, or I guess in the SpongeBob parts, since I'm not talking about We've Got Scurvy. This episode is, thankfully, not a musical, but it does have a few different songs, and they range in terms of how much I like them and how much they add to the episode. The first song, A Day Like This, is pretty good. Like, I'd listen to that independently of this episode. It also very much gives the late 2000s, and I think the visuals accompanying this song are neat. We watch as SpongeBob gets ready for his day. Then there's the song that accompanies the flashback of the old Krusty Krab commercial. I don't really have much to say about this one, I just like it, plain and simple. And then there's the song from the old-timey version of SpongeBob, and I thought that was really cute as well. And of course, I can't forget about the alternative versions of the theme song. I liked them, they were fun. I really don't know what else I could say here. Patrick's one is made more amusing by the existence of the Patrick Star Show. I'll say that. The next thing I want to talk about are all of the little quote-unquote flashbacks in this episode, since they are a significant part of the episode's structure, and you could even call them a running gag in a way. Clearly, this episode is supposed to mimic a clip show, except it doesn't use old clips but rather creates new ones. And there's been a lot of criticism about the way this episode is structured, and I can understand that criticism. However, I think it's funny that, if you think about it, this episode really couldn't win. Not if it wanted to keep this clip structure anyhow, because if it had used previous clips from the show, it would have been criticized for being a clip show, and since it made new clips, it was criticized for that. For me, I don't mind either way whether the episode used old clips or made new clips, as long as there was enough material for the episode to have an actual plot outside of that, which it does. Honestly, the only thing I don't like about the quote unquote flashbacks is that some of them make timeline things confusing, but also I don't care because I pick and choose my canon for the show. But moving beyond that, I like how throughout this episode the flashbacks are played around with. Like with the second flashback of Squidward sleeping, I love how Mr. Krabs is like, "Don't make me have a flashback," before calling bullshit on Squidward. During the flashback of Plankton being launched, I noticed how much I really liked the varying presentations of these flashbacks. Another flashback I liked was the one about decorating the Krusty Krab. I have a soft spot for gags like that, like in Krusty Towers with Squidward's room. I also loved how Mr. Krabs ended up teleporting through SpongeBob's flashback about the formula. God, how many times am I going to have to say flashback during this review? I'm almost done talking about them, I swear. The last flashback I'm going to mention is the one about Sandy and SpongeBob getting married. Sigh. This was obviously only put in for the ratings bait since it was played up in the advertisements, and it's annoying. Like, it's not even done in a cute way, it's just weird. Why was this moment even in a play in the first place? I know it's for the gag, but at least make it make sense. And y'all already know how I feel about putting SpongeBob in romantic situations. Not a fan. So this was a moment I did not like. Moving on, I want to spend some time talking about the plot of this episode. In my opinion, the plot is perfectly fine. It's not incredibly interesting, but it fits the episode nicely and it gets us from point A to point B. The 117th anniversary of the Krusty Krab is a good event to center Truth or Square around, since the restaurant is such a central location in this show. And I'll admit, I don't really care for Plankton's little stealing the formula plot in this episode, but, I mean, if this episode was gonna focus on the Krusty Krab and celebrating the show, then it makes sense to include this considering it's one of the more foundational plots of the show. And then the whole aspect of SpongeBob and friends being stuck in a freezer, that's fine too. It's a decent main conflict. Like, yeah, maybe it's a bit underwhelming for a 10th anniversary special, but I honestly think that speaks to the show's capacity to use simple plots effectively. Really, the biggest issue out of everything regarding the plot is the lack of some very important characters. Like, oh, I don't know, Sandy? She literally only shows up in that one notorious scene, and that's it. I find that to be kind of utterly ridiculous, since this is an hour-long 10th anniversary special, and she is one of the big five. Also missing are Pearl and Mrs. Puff, though they were at least in that notorious scene as well. Noticing how that may also have been a reason why that scene was promoted so heavily. Interesting. Anyway, do you guys see a pattern here? Because I do. The rant simmers under my skin, but I must stay focused. Anyway, back to the plot. So, eventually, SpongeBob and Co. bust out of the vents, just to find that everyone left. And then we get a very interesting song that I personally do not care for, but the ending of this episode is very classically SpongeBob, with a few jokes and SpongeBob simply enjoying his job, which is perfect for this special. The last element of this special I'd like to discuss is probably the most important thing beyond the plot, which is the humor. How funny is this episode? That's the question, isn't it? Well, personally, I think it's really funny. I loved the moment at the beginning where it's revealed that SpongeBob's line of alarm clocks goes into Squidward's house, like that was such a SpongeBob thing to do, and it was amusing. Or later in the episode when it turns out that Mr. Krabs hired Patrick as security, and when Patrick pins Squidward to the wall, that was great as well. Generally, there's just a good banter going on between our four main characters all throughout this episode, and it's very enjoyable to watch. I liked Patrick's high school diploma comment. I thought the surveillance room scene was absolutely brilliant. Like, I love how random and unexplained it is. I also liked the bit with the rejected theme songs, both from a song standpoint, like I said earlier, but also from a humor standpoint. I think the latter half of Truth or Square isn't as funny as the first half, but I think the entire episode is pretty amusing, so this isn't damning. And then I think that the ending joke of the episode is hilarious. Okay, I lied. There's one last thing I wanted to talk about, but it's a bit more zoomed out in scope than what I've been talking about so far. So even though I obviously haven't reviewed it yet, I'd like to compare this 10th anniversary special with the 20th anniversary special. If I had to choose between Truth or Square and SpongeBob's Big Birthday Blowout as the better anniversary celebration, I'd probably choose the latter. And I'm not talking about enjoyment right now, although I'm not going to pretend like I don't enjoy the 20th more than the 10th. Now, what I'm saying here is that the 20th anniversary special had a lot more heart and soul put into it than this episode did. Perhaps this is a result of that special having the double duty of honoring Steven Hillenburg, but whatever the case, I find that SpongeBob's Big Birthday Blowout felt more like a celebration of the show and its history. This special, on the other hand, is more of a celebration of the show's impact and popularity, and there's nothing wrong with that. And this isn't me saying that Truth or Square is a bad anniversary special. In fact, I'm saying the opposite. I may prefer the approach of the 20th anniversary special, but Truth or Square does well at celebrating the show's 10th anniversary. Alright, time to wrap up this long ass review. So first things first, Truth or Square 100% did not deserve the hate it got and continues to get. Like, this shit is good. I don't know what to tell y'all. I think that the older this episode grows, the funnier it becomes, especially with the celebrity cameos. I also think that the humor in this episode is truly underrated, perhaps because so much of that humor is wrapped up in the patchy segments and is geared towards adults. Hey, maybe that means that this special was envisioned to appeal to people who maybe had grown up with SpongeBob. I never considered that until this moment, and I think that adds an extra level of analysis in viewing this episode. How fun. Anyway, the SpongeBob segments of this episode are plenty funny as well, so the criticism that this episode isn't funny just doesn't land for me. And then in general, I thought that Truth or Square was a good celebration of the show's 10th anniversary, although a number of characters that should have been here in a substantive capacity were not, and I'm not happy about that. But that's just about the only really significant problem I have with this episode, meaning that this episode fits perfectly in my great tier, where it comes into a score of 8.7 out of 10. As always, I'll be ending this review with some closing thoughts of mine. I packed quite a few tangents into this one, now I feel like I have no material to close things out with. I guess one thing I could talk about is, okay, I'm trying to figure out how to word this. So, like, when I was considering the clip show aspect of this episode, and I mentioned that the episode was kind of invoking this trope of the clip show, but still like making new clips for it, so it's not really a clip show like that, I started to wonder how many criticisms of the show, particularly in this era, came from jokes not landing with people to the extent they weren't even thought to be jokes at all. Because I had never really considered the meta aspect of making this episode look like a clip show from a stylistic standpoint, but now to me, I'm seeing it as this purposeful decision again made to have the show buy into its own hype. Does that make sense? It's like, it's invoking the image of this really big celebration while also still being its own episode, but it almost feels strangely ironic when doing this, but maybe that's just me projecting my thoughts onto the episode and it's playing this entirely straight. God, I hope this makes sense. I feel like I can't explain it any other way, but this still feels like a jumble of words. Making the visuals for this review was hard as hell, because it was difficult to figure out what I wanted to do. And then there were some ideas that I had that I just couldn't do for one reason or another, so hopefully this is sufficient. And then my final thought is that it's honestly so fucking cool that I've covered 10 years of this show now. Like, yeah, I'm only in season 6, two reviews away from finishing at least, but still, I've covered a lot. Who knew we'd come so far? I certainly didn't when I recorded that first review. Hell, I hadn't even written my season 6 reviews by that point. It's been 2 years since I started doing the video reviews. Time flies. If I hadn't been so preoccupied with creating the Arcane video, I would have made a post celebrating that anniversary. Oh well, it happens. And I think that's just about all for me today, so I'll close things out here and I'll see y'all in the next review.